All right, so now moving along in Egyptian myths and tales and legends, we're moving on into the New Kingdom now, which is the late Imperial phase of Egyptian civilization that comes in after the Hyksos have invaded from Palestine. They have come in on two-wheeled horse chariots, which the Egyptians never used or needed because the entire civilization was simply based on boats going up and down the Nile as far as transportation goes. You wanted to go somewhere, you hopped on a boat and went along the Nile. There was no need for the wheel. So they didn't have it until the Hyksos, who were Semites, who came in, raiding in out of Palestine with a new bow, a compound bow, this war machine assemblage that comes in and then conquers northern Egypt, the Delta Valley, completely conquers it. They set up a capital there at Avaris, which later becomes Tanis, and now they run Egypt, these foreigners. One of them has a Hebrew name, Jacob. That's the name of Jacob. It's on the list there of the rulers. So some of these, there are some hypotheses that the expulsion of the Hyksos is really the Exodus. I don't think that it is, but clearly we're beginning to shade into that world here with the appearance of the name of Jacob amongst one of these rulers. And then so this takes place about 1675 BC. It lasts for about a century and a half. Long about 1500, the brothers Amoza and Kamoza, note the suffixes there, Moza, Moses, which means to be born or drawn out of, as in being drawn out of water, or let's say even amniotic fluid. And they chase out the Hyksos. They conquer them, chase them out, and then in response to that, Egypt forms its universal state, which is equivalent to, let's say in terms of Spenglerian morphology, it's equivalent to the Roman Empire, period. This is the imperial stage. They conquer all of Palestine. They go all the way up to the Hittites, who stop them. They're too tough, the Hittites are, to conquer. And so they stop, and they have to form treaties with the Hittites and so forth. So that becomes the empire now for a long time, until long about the time of Akhenaten in 1350. They lose everything because Akhenaten didn't give a shit. He could care less about war. He wasn't interested in conquest. He just sort of sleptwalked as far as the empire went, and they pretty much lost most of it during his reign. There was never what it was after that. So this sort of sets the stage for the world in which this tale, the tale of the doomed prince, occurs as one of the world's first fairy tales, one of the first and oldest fairy tales. And you can tell that the tenor of it is quite a bit different. It feels like an orally told story, whereas the tale of the eloquent peasant was so well crafted, it could only come into being through writing with that kind of form and structure and intricacy. And the same thing with the tale of Sinui. Those are written tales. The story of the Shipwreck Sailor might have been an orally passed down story. It had a kind of fairy tale magical quality to it, as does this one. And this one, also consistent with an orally told tale, has different versions. In the three different authors that I've been using, Gaston Maspero and Miriam Lichtheim, and this woman here, M.V. Seton Williams, who just does a popular retelling of these. They're not really translations. They're all different, and Maspero's is the best, as befits a grand old scholar of the time of James Henry Breasted at the turn of the 20th century there in 1900-ish. Okay, so let's look at the story then. So the story begins as a kind of once upon a time where there's a king and queen in Egypt who are having trouble conceiving a child. So the king prays to the gods to make his wife pregnant, and it works. She gets pregnant, she has a child. But then the 7 Hathors come along, and they say, the child is fated to die either by a snake, a crocodile, or a dog. He will meet his fate in one of those ways. And then they leave. So this is kind of a grim atmosphere. Now, these 7 Hathors, I believe, are most likely the 7 stars of the Big Dipper. This story is full of astronomical allegories. In fact, the whole story is an astronomical allegory. And it also contains the earliest, let's say, seed, which later echoes through Persian myth in the Shahnameh and down to Grimm's fairy tales of the story of Rapunzel. You can clearly see that there's a genealogy here going back to the world's earliest known fairy tale, as far as we know. This is 1500 BC. And so what happens is, so these 3 animals are constellations in the Egyptian zodiac. The serpent, the dog is most likely Canis Major, and there's a constellation near the pole star with a beast with a crocodile head that is right near the pole star. And then so we have that, and then we have to take into account the so the fact that he's now has to be sheltered from the world, kind of like the Buddha. So they build a tower that encloses him, and he's not allowed to leave it. But secretly, he's been climbing out the window and climbing back up again, which is a skill that will come in handy a bit later on. And then so he sees, looking from the window, a dog following a guy on the ground. He's never seen a dog before, and he asks his dad if he can have one. And the dad, thinking about the prophecy, is hesitant, but he says, okay, and he tells his servant to go get him a dog, but just make sure it's a puppy so that it's harmless. So he goes to get the puppy, and he brings it back, and so now he has this companion. He's living in Egypt, and he decides now he wants to leave. He wants to go explore the world. He doesn't care about the prophecy, and he's old enough, let's say maybe he's 17 or something like that, and he decides he's going. He's done here. So he takes his dog, and they leave, and they wander for a while, finally wander into Syria, into Palestine, and they encounter a prince of a place called Naharina. So this prince is there, who is now holding a contest where he has his daughter, perhaps not coincidentally maybe, who's inside of a tower also, and he has agreed to award her to anyone who can climb up the tower. So there are all these princes and courtiers and whatever they are, suitors, let's say, and they keep trying to climb the tower. They can't do it. And of course this kid from Egypt can do it, since he's the protagonist. So he climbs up. He climbs in through the window. She sees him. She's delighted with him. But the father says, so who the hell are you now? And he says, well, I'm the son of a general, of a charioteer in Egypt. And he says, I'm not giving my daughter to this vagabond from Egypt. That's ridiculous. And she says, oh, yes, you are. Otherwise, I'm going to be a spinster for the rest of my life. I have no interest in any of these other men. This is a motif known as the refusal of the suitors. So the father's sort of forced to say, okay, I guess I'll bless the marriage. So they get married. So they're living in Syria now. And now the kid decides that he wants to go back to Egypt. So he's nostalgic for Egypt. So he and his wife suit up. And as they're in the desert somewhere in Syria, they've got a tent over them one night. And then the guy's asleep. And then the woman sees a snake come into the tent. And she quickly pours a bowl of milk and has the snake drink it, and it falls asleep. Then she pulls out a sword and hacks off its head. And then he wakes up and she says, thus I have prevented the prophecy from fulfilling itself with regard to the serpent. So there's that. So that's been taken care of. But now as they're coming into Egypt, he's coming back to the world that he left, and he decides he wants to take a swim in the Nile. So he's getting into the Nile, and there of course appears the crocodile. So the crocodile comes out and it can talk. Now the crocodile has been consorting with a giant. So the giant now is another constellation. The giant is Osiris, which is the constellation of Orion. They called it the giant. And Maspero even points that out in his notes. So we have yet another astronomical figure here. And I think the whole story is mostly about Orion, which comes out, it rises out of the southeast, and then eventually it sets, and then spends a couple of months, about 70 days before it reappears. And so when you mummify the dead, you have to wait 70 days. You have to wait for Orion to come back around, so it's a 70-day process, ideally 2 months, to time it with the rise of Orion, Osiris, who comes up, and then Sirius, which is Isis, comes up right after him. And so the giant then keeps the crocodile inside of a room and refuses to let him out. And when the crocodile goes to sleep, then the giant goes out for a stroll. And this goes on, the text, Maspero's text says for 2 months, about 2 months, which is indeed the time of Orion, so it's 70 days. So, so the giant has been doing this, having this relationship with the crocodile. It's an astronomical allegory and a fairy tale, of course. And the kid shows up, and then the crocodile starts taunting the kid about his fate, saying, I am your fate, and I will devour you, intimidating him. But the giant looks after him and watches over him. And then here, there are two different versions of what happens next. In this text, the crocodile gives him a test and says, you have to dig a hole in the sand, pour water into it, and that water has to stay there. And of course it's sand, so it's going to leak out into the sand. So he can't do it. And he tells his wife this, and she says, oh, I know a special magical herb that I can go get that will stop it from, the sand from absorbing the water. So hang on. She gets on a horse. She knows where this hill is, where there grows like a four-leaf clover. It's a plant with four leaves, and she brings it back. And just as the crocodile is about to devour him, she puts it into the water, and it prevents the water from going down, and the crocodile leaves. But I like Maspero's version better, where the giant doesn't even exist in this version with M.V. Seton Williams, thus completely misunderstanding the whole story. The giant is the core of the story, is the constellation of Orion, Osiris. And so he protects the boy, and his wife knows about this, that the crocodile is going to eat him, and the crocodile says, I'm going to eat you tonight by sunset unless you kill the giant for me, and if you can't kill the giant, too bad. The kid doesn't know what to do, but his wife has an idea, and she runs and gets an axe, and she brings it back and hurls it at the crocodile, and it stops him, and then the giant comes along and finishes it off, kills the crocodile, and that's it. So now he's been saved from a fate by being devoured by a crocodile. So the snake and the crocodile, he's not going to die either one of those two ways, but the dog is still left, and they still have this dog that's been following them around as a companion. So then what happens is that back, meanwhile, in Syria, in Naharina, where there's a group of princes now who are brothers, who are ravaging the land, and they remember the kid and the daughter, and perhaps one of them failed in the contest. I don't know why it's so important for them to have them, but they tell the king, the prince of Naharina, that they want to know where that kid went with the daughter, because they're going to kill him and rape the daughter. That's the plan. He says, I don't know where they went. They went somewhere. Who knows? So then they kill him, and then they spread out to the four quarters, and the ones who go south toward Egypt eventually find them in the following manner, in which I guess they see like a dust cloud or something on the horizon, and so the boy and his wife go inside a cave with the dog to hide, and they're in this cave for 2 days. Now note that they're in a cave for 2 days. The moon is dark for 2 days, so very obviously this pair, the woman is probably the moon, and the man is probably the sun, and they've set. So they're in this cave for 2 days. Then the marauders are out nearby, and the dog barks, the fucking thing. It comes out and barks, thus betraying their presence. So there are two different endings here. In one version, they simply go into in this version with Seton Williams, they go into the cave and they simply kill the prince and the princess. But in Maspero's version, which I prefer and which is probably closer to how the story is supposed to go, they go into the cave, they kill the princess, and they knock the prince unconscious. And so he's unconscious, and they drag the bodies out and leave them out for the vultures, and they kill the dog, and then they leave. And so the kid wakes up and he sees his dead wife there, and he prays to the gods to resurrect her. And so the hot horse come back, and they take pity on him. The sun god Re also takes pity on him because of their loyal devotion to each other. So he says, all right, we can do this. And so they restore his wife back to life, and that's it. They're basically sort of resurrected, and then which would be perfectly suitable if these were planets. If this was an astronomical allegory, then they would come back. And Maspero complains about this, even though he records this ending. He complains about it, and he thinks that it should be the ending where they're just both killed and being betrayed by the dogs, so that the boy should meet his fate as it was prophesied. But I think this version is, with them being restored, it's like they're being set back up into the heavens, like one of the Greek astronomical myths. Makes more sense because of the astronomical allegories that are going on in this story. And you can see the echoes with Rapunzel, just as a footnote here, with the tower. When each one of them starts out in a tower, and then the boy scaling the tower to get to the woman who's being held in there. Very similar to the scene in Rapunzel, with Rapunzel letting down the tresses of her locks of her hair so that the wandering prince can then climb up the tower. Seems like a direct echo. And also that same image occurs in the Shahnameh, the great Persian epic written by Ferdowsi around the year 1000 AD, in which the parents of the great hero there, Rostam, are Zal and Rudabe. And they do the same thing. Rudabe is held up in a tower, and she lets down her tresses so that Zal can grab onto them and use them as ropes to climb up. And so there's another echo of the same motif, and we can track this then from Egypt, 1500 BC, all the way down to Ferdowsi, and I'm sure it's probably appeared somewhere in between that I haven't noticed yet, probably in Hindu myths, all the way down to Ferdowsi, 1000, and then on into Europe with Grimm's fairy tales, which aren't written down until the 19th century, but they've probably been orally passed along for centuries there. So we can see by looking back at these earliest myths and tales how they form the bedrock for later literature, for biblical stories, for Grimm's fairy tales. Echoes, 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 echoes. This is the archaeology of myth and history and fairy tales. And if we could go back past the threshold of writing, these are the earliest written stories in Egypt, and we'll also look at Mesopotamia as well. These are the world's earliest written stories, but assuredly they would also have echoes if we knew what the oral stories were that the Egyptians and the Sumerians were telling and passing along before writing came into being and civilization got up and running there. We would be able to keep tracking it all the way back, ultimately and presumably to the Paleolithic. So, okay, so we'll leave it there with that tale.